What's up you guys, Sasha here. Just moments ago the Chancellor has gone and surprised everybody by announcing a major revamp to the job support scheme, which is replacing the job retention scheme that runs out at the end of October, with the new scheme starting from the 1st of November onwards. Now, I was literally in the middle of editing a video that I'd filmed about the impact of there being no real replacement from the 1st of November and what this means for businesses, what this means for jobs. I have had to completely can this video and go and make a new one because this new change is quite material, it's quite substantial. It's also quite difficult to understand. So because of that, I wanted to just take you through exactly what has been announced, exactly what it actually means in terms of numbers, because I've gone and read some initial reports by the likes of the BBC, by the likes of other big established media, and the thing that I'm beginning to realize is a lot of the big, well-established media websites don't really understand what has been announced either, because some of the numbers that they're publishing are flat wrong when you actually look at the specifics of what has been announced by the government. So I just wanted to walk you through very, very simply, one step at a time, exactly what they've come out with. So what they are now saying is from the 1st of November, the new scheme will support businesses who are in trouble or who've had a drop of revenue because of the whole ongoing pandemic. But unlike the previous announcement, unlike the previous version, there's one huge change. And this change, I think, is much more important than everybody else seems to think because they haven't been covering it, and that is your business doesn't now legally have to shut in order for you to be able to access this support. Now, if you determine that your business has been affected, and for small businesses there's no means testing at all, just like with the furlough scheme, you can apply and get the support. So that's a huge difference, because companies who aren't restaurants, pubs, bars or gyms or any of those types of places, just regular offices, under the previous version of the scheme would not have been eligible, but now they are. But here is what it does. Now, employees do have to go back, and the employer will now have to pay them partially, with the government putting up a bigger chunk on top, very similar to the furlough scheme, but the way it works is a bit different. So now employees have to go back to work for at least 1 day a week. So 20% of their normal amount of time that they work, they have to go back to work for. And the way that the government have announced it is actually quite complicated. They've said that they will support employees for up to 95%, according to their own thing, of wage costs if they're retained through to February. Now, I'm going to get to that a little bit later. That's not actually true. What they are saying, if we just go through line by line, is they'll provide up to 61.67% of the wages not worked, up to £1,541.75 per month. Now, what this means in reality is that 61.67% doesn't apply to the total amount of wages that an employee is going to receive. It only applies to the amount of time not worked. So if we work on the basis that as a struggling business, that you're just trying to make ends meet, and you're trying to make the most out of the scheme, just to kind of show the point in the most extreme case, then what will happen in that case is if an employee goes back to work under the scheme, so you have chosen to retain them rather than to let them go at the end of this month. So what will happen is the business will have to pay 20% of the salary because that's the 1 day worked, and then the government will have to then go and pay 61.67% of the 80% of the time that the employee does not work, which comes out at about 49.3%. You, as a business, will then have to go and pay an extra 5% of the remaining 80%. So the business will then have to pay 4%. And as I understand it, it isn't actually explicitly put here, but as I understand it, based on the information provided, the employer will still have to pay the Class 1 national insurance contributions and the pension contributions that they are liable for. So although this says that the employer will only have to pay 5%, it is quite disingenuous because it's 5% of the non-worked hours. The employer still has to pay at least the minimum 20% for the worked hours plus all these other things. So if we take 100% as the total salary that an employee is earning, then on that basis, the employer will have to pay 20%, because that's the 1 day, plus the 4%, which is 5% of the 80%, plus the 13% class 1 national insurance, plus the 3% minimum pension contributions, which totals at 40% of the salary. The government will then put up 49.3%. So the total amount the employee will be getting is 73.3% because the Class 1 national insurance and the pension contributions won't actually go into their bank account. So what this means versus the furlough scheme at the end of October is that the two are much more similar than they were under the previous arrangement. Under the previous arrangement, there was a huge drop in what the businesses would be able to claim, and as a result, a lot of people would probably have been making a huge number of staff redundant today and tomorrow, because today and tomorrow are exactly 1 week before the end of November, and with over 25% of all permanent employees in the UK having worked under 2 years in their current jobs, a lot of people on 0 hours contracts, on part-time contracts, on contractual terms rather than employment terms with their employer, a lot of people do have a 1 week notice period. And so it is no surprise that this morning the government urgently went and put out something, because otherwise tomorrow we could have been staring at a huge deluge of people losing their jobs. But will this help it? Will this help it? So under the furlough scheme, if I do exactly the same maths, the employer in October is liable for 20% of the employee's salary plus the same 13% national insurance plus the 3% pension for a total of 36%. So the employer will now have to pay just 4% more, only 10% on top of what they were already paying in October, which sounds relatively reasonable. I think a lot of people who have had staff on this furlough scheme in October will probably choose to keep them on the same scheme because the cost to them doesn't really change. The government share will drop. It was 60% in October for a total of 80% paid to the employee. It is now just 49.3% of the total salary that the person is going to be receiving. So they are not paying as much. And what this means is that people who are employed through this scheme will now have to take a pay cut, because the employer is allowed, according to the scheme, to pay less than what they're contractually obliged to do. And now the worker will be able to earn 73.3 roughly percent of their normal salary. So this is good in one sense. It is good in the sense that if some employers are still in a perilous situation, they're not making the money that they were, and they had staff on furlough, they're able through the scheme to retain that same staff on furlough, subject to them not having any urgent and pressing financial issues, which mean they have to stop the whole furlough scheme. However, it is bad for two major reasons. One, if people who are already on minimum wage jobs, if people who are already struggling financially, they're behind on their bills, they're struggling to make their mortgage payments, they're struggling to pay for their bills, they're struggling to pay rent, whatever it is, put food on the table, they have already had to take, effectively according to the way that the furlough scheme has been put out, a 20% cut on their pay for the last few months, and now they're going to have to take another 7% pay cut. So essentially they've lost over a quarter of their salary as a result of this. So that's going to hit those people hard. And the problem here is that this is a 6-month scheme announcement. It may be extended if things go well into next year. It is uncertain as to what's going to happen. So for the foreseeable future, the people who are going to be paid according to the scheme will see a pay cut. For businesses, the problem with this is that the help that the government is providing is roughly the same. And even if your employees are only coming back for just 1 day a week, so 20% of the amount of time that you are able to actually get value from that employee, you are still going to be paying an effective 40% of that employee's salary when you take into account the 20% that you have to pay in salary, the 4% which is for the unworked hours that the employee is not working, plus a 13% national insurance, plus a 3% pension contributions. So essentially what this means is if you have somebody on a median wage of about £25,000 per year, the employer will still be liable for £10,000 per year out of that. So over the next 6 months, that's £5,000 worth of payments in order for that employee to stay employed by the company. And if the business is in dire straits and not making any money, having to pay £5,000 per employee on that median salary may prove too hard for some companies. Now, as of the latest data available from the government for the end of August, as many as 3.7 million people are expected to be still furloughed by companies, and that's only a month and a half ago. So the situation we're in is that a huge proportion of the UK workforce is still being funded to a large degree by the government and not by the businesses that employ them. So this step is crucial to try to stem that tide, but the problem is now that in September and October employers have had to pay considerably more towards the cost of their staff than they were paying earlier this year, and now that this scheme is pushing that boundary even further, What is going to happen to the employers who are not expressly supported by some of the grants that are announced by the government? The government is saying that they're going to provide local authorities with grants for things like pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels, and other leisure industry facilities. What happens to every other type of business who is suffering, in some cases just the same or more as a bar or a pub, because their services are not in demand? Let's say they're supplying the bars and services and the hotels with goods. Let's say they have, walk through traffic normally who buy stuff which has disappeared overnight. What happens to all of those businesses who don't get any of those grants? They don't get support with the cost of running their offices, with leases that they can't get out of. What happens to them when their revenues are at zero, but they're still having to pay 40% of the cost of their staff wages? This is going to be a really, really, really difficult play. It is a good thing that something is happening, in my opinion, that something is happening where the government is trying to help businesses in a way, but I kind of feel I'm not sure that this is necessarily going to stop the massive load of redundancies that were expected over the next week or two, because the businesses are now going to be looking at it saying, well, for the next 6 months, there's not going to be any visible improvement in the financial situation, because that's how long this scheme has been announced for. That's what the government is now trying to prepare people for in terms of how long various restrictions on movement are going to be out for. So because of all of that, I fear that we're still going to be seeing a lot of redundancies coming up, although probably far less than it would have been had the Chancellor not announced the scheme. I hope you guys found this useful. If you have, please make sure you smash the like button so that more people can get this information explained to them in a slightly more clear way than the way that the government paper is doing it or some of the other news outlets. If you're interested in more updates on this and other personal finance topics, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you get notifications. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys later.